At exactly 5:42 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, March 6th, 2026, a decision signed inside the White House may have triggered the most dangerous economic confrontation ever seen between the United States and Canada. President Donald J. Trump quietly authorized an executive order titled Northern Border Reconstruction. Within minutes, Washington delivered a 24-hour ultimatum to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, a man widely known as the financial architect behind some of the most aggressive monetary strategies of the last 2 decades. The accusation coming from Washington is extraordinary. U.S. intelligence claims Ottawa secretly engineered an $815 billion parallel economic corridor with an East Asian technology coalition, a system allegedly designed to reroute continental trade away from the U.S. dollar and establish an alternative financial infrastructure across North America. The White House has labeled the move economic aggression against the United States, and the retaliation is already underway. If Canada refuses to comply by 5:42 a.m. tomorrow, the United States will impose a 35% Universal Sovereign Tariff on every Canadian export, immediately suspend Canada's USMCA privileges, and cut off Starshield satellite intelligence feeds, a system that currently supports large portions of Canada's continental surveillance network across 9.9 million square kilometers of territory. At the same time, U.S. National Guard units have begun mobilizing across all 119 border crossings, freezing roughly $2.6 billion in trade every hour and sending the Canadian dollar into a sudden 12% collapse. Mainstream media is still scrambling to understand what just happened, but the clock is already ticking. So subscribe right now, because the next 24 hours may determine whether North America enters the largest economic rupture in modern history. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly why this confrontation between Donald Trump and Mark Carney could become the most dangerous economic standoff in North American history. In this analysis, I will guide you through 3 critical demands buried inside Washington's 24-hour ultimatum, demands that could force Canada to dismantle an $815 billion economic strategy almost overnight. Then, I will lay out the exact chain reaction already unfolding across financial markets, including why the Canadian dollar suddenly plunged 12% in a matter of hours, why $2.6 billion in cross-border trade is now frozen every single hour, and why analysts believe the USMCA trade framework could collapse before tomorrow morning. But more importantly, I will break down the strategic chess match now unfolding between 2 very different figures: Donald Trump, the hardline negotiator using tariffs and military leverage as pressure tools, and Mark Carney, the financial strategist who helped shape global monetary policy for over a decade. Finally, I will present 3 scenarios that could unfold once this 24-hour deadline expires, scenarios that could determine whether Canada faces economic isolation, a currency crisis, or a completely militarized border with the United States. Because what happens next will not just affect Canada or the U.S. It could reshape the entire financial architecture of North America. To understand how serious this crisis really is, we need to break down 3 layers of pressure currently being applied to Canada. Each layer is designed not just to punish Ottawa, but to force Prime Minister Mark Carney into a decision that could redefine the balance of economic power across the continent. Let's start with the first layer. Pressure point 1. The $815 billion parallel economic corridor, according to the intelligence brief referenced in Washington's executive order. Canadian officials allegedly spent the last 18 months quietly coordinating with a coalition of East Asian technology firms and sovereign investment funds. The project is now being referred to in policy circles as the Parallel Economic Corridor. Its estimated value, $815 billion. The goal, according to U.S. analysts, was not simply infrastructure investment. The corridor would allegedly create a separate digital trade network linking Canadian ports, logistics systems, semiconductor supply chains, and AI cloud infrastructure directly to Asian markets, bypassing traditional U.S.-centered financial routing systems. In simple terms, Washington believes Canada was attempting to build a trade architecture that weakens the dominance of the US dollar across North America. Former Treasury advisor David McCormick reportedly warned in a private briefing that such a corridor could redirect as much as 18% of North American digital trade flows within 5 years. For the United States, that is not just a trade disagreement. It is a strategic financial threat. Pressure point 2, the 35% Universal Sovereign Tariff. Now we move to the second mechanism of pressure, the tariff weapon. The executive order signed at 5:42 a.m. outlines a 35% universal sovereign tariff on all Canadian exports entering the United States if Ottawa refuses to comply within the 24-hour window. To understand the scale of this threat, consider the numbers. Canada sends roughly 75% of its exports to the United States, representing nearly $520 billion in annual trade. A tariff at that magnitude would immediately disrupt supply chains across automotive manufacturing, energy pipelines, agriculture, and technology components. Economists at several private financial institutions estimate that such a tariff could erase between 3% and 5% of Canada's GDP within a single fiscal year. And the market reaction is already beginning. Within hours of the announcement, the Canadian dollar fell 12% against the US dollar, marking one of the sharpest single-session declines in modern currency trading history. Former Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey reportedly told colleagues that a shock of this scale could trigger a cascading liquidity crisis if capital flight accelerates. This is no longer theoretical pressure. The financial markets have already begun to respond. If you're starting to see how serious this situation is becoming, hit the like button right now, because the third pressure point may be the most dangerous of all. Pressure point 3. The Starshield intelligence cutoff. While the tariff threat dominates headlines, defense analysts are focusing on something even more alarming. The White House order includes a clause authorizing the suspension of Canadian access to Starshield satellite intelligence feeds. Starshield, the secure satellite network developed by SpaceX for U.S. defense operations, currently supports portions of continental surveillance, airspace monitoring, and early warning systems across North America. Canada relies on shared data streams from this network to help monitor its 9.9 million square kilometers of territory, including vast Arctic regions where radar coverage remains limited. If those feeds are cut, Canadian defense planners would suddenly lose a major portion of their real-time situational awareness capabilities. And this is where the psychological pressure intensifies. Shortly after the ultimatum was announced, Elon Musk, who has been advising Washington on satellite infrastructure strategy, posted a short but striking message online. He wrote, "The old Canadian economic model is obsolete. Economic sovereignty cannot exist without security protection. Continental restructuring is inevitable." Many analysts interpreted that statement as a signal that the confrontation may not be limited to tariffs or trade negotiations. It could represent a broader effort to reorganize the economic structure of North America itself. The psychological duel, Trump versus Carney at the center of this confrontation, are two very different personalities. Donald Trump is operating with a strategy built around maximum pressure in a compressed time frame, a tactic he has used repeatedly in negotiations involving tariffs, sanctions, and geopolitical disputes. Mark Carney, on the other hand, built his career navigating financial crises through careful monetary engineering and long-term strategic planning. But now those two approaches are colliding in a 24-hour window. Trump's message appears straightforward: dismantle the corridor, return to the U.S.-centered economic system, or face immediate economic punishment. Carney's challenge is far more complex. If he capitulates too quickly, Canada may appear economically subordinate to Washington. But if he resists, the country could face currency instability, trade collapse, and strategic isolation. And with the clock already ticking toward tomorrow morning's deadline, every hour that passes increases the pressure. With less than 24 hours remaining before the deadline expires, analysts are now focusing on what could happen the moment the clock reaches 5:42 a.m. tomorrow morning. Because once that moment arrives, the confrontation between Washington and Ottawa will move from threats to consequences. And right now, there are three possible scenarios being discussed in financial and defense circles. Scenario 1, total economic isolation of Canada. The first scenario is the most immediate and potentially the most devastating. If Prime Minister Mark Carney refuses to dismantle the parallel economic corridor and rejects Washington's ultimatum outright, the United States could activate the full enforcement package outlined in the executive order. That means the 35% Universal Sovereign Tariff goes into effect instantly. For Canada, the impact would be immediate. Nearly 3/4 of the country's export economy depends on access to the American market. Automotive parts, oil shipments, timber, agricultural goods, and advanced manufacturing components would suddenly face massive trade barriers overnight. Supply chains that took decades to build could begin collapsing within weeks. Several market analysts have warned that under this scenario, Canada could face the fastest economic isolation event ever experienced by a G7 country. And once capital markets detect that level of instability, global investment flows tend to move quickly. Which leads directly to the second scenario. Scenario 2, hyperdevaluation of the Canadian dollar if the confrontation escalates, but Canada attempts to maintain the corridor project. The financial markets could become the primary battlefield. We have already seen the first signal, the Canadian dollar falling 12% within hours of the announcement. But if trade disruptions continue and investor confidence collapses, that decline could accelerate dramatically. Currency strategists are warning that the Canadian dollar could face a cascading sell-off driven by institutional investors pulling capital out of Canadian assets. When this happens, the currency does not simply fall slowly. It can enter a self-reinforcing cycle where declining exchange rates trigger further capital flight, which then drives the currency even lower. Under extreme conditions, some economists believe the Canadian dollar could lose 25% to 35% of its value in a matter of months. That would immediately increase the cost of imports, spike inflation, and force Canada's central bank into emergency monetary decisions. But there is a third scenario, one that may carry the most profound long-term consequences. Scenario 3, the militarized managed border. If negotiations break down completely, Washington could move beyond tariffs and financial pressure towards something far more structural, a managed border regime. Under this system, the United States would effectively transform the northern frontier into a highly controlled economic checkpoint system. Trade flows would be restricted, inspected, and routed through a limited number of authorized crossings. The mobilization of National Guard units across 119 border crossings may already be the first signal of that possibility. In practice, a managed border would mean that every truck, train shipment, and industrial component crossing between the two countries would be subject to strict economic authorization. For industries that rely on hour-by-hour supply chains, such a system would fundamentally change how North American manufacturing operates. And if this structure remained in place long enough, it could permanently shift the economic relationship between the United States and Canada. Because once borders become militarized economic filters, the trust that once defined continental trade may be extremely difficult to restore. Right now, the clock is counting down. Less than 24 hours separate North America from a decision that could permanently reshape its economic structure. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been described as one of the most stable economic partnerships in the world. Trillions of dollars in trade, deeply integrated supply chains, and one of the longest peaceful borders in history. But today, that assumption is being tested. Donald Trump has chosen a strategy of maximum pressure, forcing the issue into a narrow window where hesitation becomes costly. Mark Carney, the financial strategist who built his reputation navigating global crises, now faces a choice that could define his entire political legacy. Does Canada step back and dismantle the corridor? Or does Ottawa resist, risking tariffs, currency shocks, and a hardened continental border? Because once 5:42 a.m. tomorrow arrives, the balance of power between these two countries may shift in ways that cannot easily be reversed. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Trump has pushed negotiations too far, or is Canada the one that overplayed its hand by trying to bypass the U.S. economic system? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every perspective. And if you want real-time updates as this situation develops, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next move in this confrontation could arrive at any moment.